Have you ever watched an animal do something that made you think, wait a second, that looks like medicine?
I have, and one of my favorite examples comes from Jane Goodall's early work in Gombe. She noticed chimpanzees swallowing whole leaves of a plant called Aspilia pleurisita. They didn't chew them, they folded them up like little parcels and just gulped them down.
Oh, right, and when she and her colleagues checked later, those same leaves turned up in the dung, but they were intact and wrapped around expelled worms. I think it was the first solid evidence that wild animals deliberately treat themselves for infection.
Yep, that observation changed the way biologists think about animal behavior. It hinted that animals can sense illness, find a remedy, and use it, not randomly, but with a purpose. And it set the stage for a whole new field called zoopharmacognosy, literally animal drug knowing. I wonder if I even said that right.
Hold on a minute. John Drake? What are you doing here? I was expecting Cam.
I get that a lot. Well, actually, not really. It'd be pretty hard to mistake me for the great Cam Gallenbar. But Cam and the team invited me to join as a guest co-host for a few episodes this season, so for today at least, you're stuck with me.
All right then. Listeners, meet John Drake, Regents Professor of Ecology and Infectious Disease Modeling at the University of Georgia, and, if I may say, a longtime friend of big biology.
Thanks, Marty. I've been a fan since episode 1, and I'm thrilled to sit in for a few conversations. The intersection of evolution, ecology, and behavior is home territory for me, and today's episode fits right in that seat swap.
Okay, then back to zoopharmacognosy. It's a field that's small but growing fast, and one of its leading voices is our guest today, Jaap de Roode, a professor of biology at Emory University. Many listeners will know Jaap from his beautiful work on monarch butterflies and their parasites.
Jaap showed that infected caterpillars prefer milkweed species that are rich in toxic cardenolides. Those toxins kill the parasite more than they harm the host, which means the caterpillars are effectively medicating themselves. It was the first clear experimental proof that self-medication could evolve through natural selection.
Jaap's new book, Doctors by Nature, tells that story and dozens more. Bears gnawing at willow bark, nature's original aspirin, woolly bears eating toxic plants to fend off parasitoid flies, sparrows weaving cigarette butts through their nests to repel mites, and even honeybees collecting tree resins to sterilize their hives. It's a natural history of medicine that spans the tree of life.
What I like about Jaap's book is that he doesn't treat these behaviors as curiosities. He asks, what makes something medicine in some biological sense, laying out 4 forms of medication: prophylaxis, therapy, body anointing, and fumigation. And then he applies strict criteria to animal behaviors to qualify them as medicating. The behavior must improve health or fitness, involve an external substance, be actively chosen, and carry a cost when infection isn't present.
And that last cost part is crucial. In nature, even the right remedy can hurt you if you take it when you don't need it. A caterpillar that eats toxic milkweed pays a price in slower growth. A chimp that swallows rough leaves risks harming its gut. And these costs are the best evidence that animals are aware of what they're doing. That is, the behavior is adaptive because they do it only when they're ill, not randomly.
Medicine, in Jaap's telling, therefore isn't a human invention, but rather an evolved strategy. Selection favors individuals that balance the benefits of treatment against the cost of toxicity or energy loss. The result looks like foresight, and maybe sometimes it is, but it's also the product of generations of trial and error.
We'll talk with Jaap about how animals discover these medicines, what sensory cues they use to taste, smell, feedback from their own physiology, and whether self-medication can influence the evolution of the parasites themselves. If a host can limit infection, maybe that pushes parasites towards lower virulence.
We'll also explore how humans might learn from nature's doctors. Farmers who let sheep choose among plants often see better parasite control. Beekeepers now use propolis strategically to reduce disease in hives. There's a lot of practical knowledge hiding in these behaviors.
And of course, we'll ask about the limits. Do animals ever make mistakes? Can they overdose, develop dependencies, or misread cues? As humans, we certainly do. So what keeps the rest of the animal kingdom from the same trap?
Beyond the science, Jaap's book is also a story about humility. We like to think medicine started with us, with shamans, pharmacists, white-coated doctors. But the impulse to heal is older and deeper. The forest and the savanna have been running clinical trials, so to speak, for millions of years.
There's something profoundly hopeful about that. It means that health is woven into the fabric of life. For monarchs, chimpanzees, bees, and people, all of us are trying to stay well in a world full of pathogens. That continuity makes biology feel personal.
It also brings wonder back to the everyday. The next time your dog eats grass or your cat rolls in catnip, maybe it's not just quirky behavior. It might be evolution's quiet wisdom at work.
So in today's episode, we dive into Jaap's research, his book, and the broader implications for ecology, evolution, and human medicine. We learn how animals self-prescribe, what the cost and benefits look like, and how this knowledge can help us care for our own species a little better.
But before we start, we're still in fundraising mode. Our goal is 500 paid Substack subscribers, and we're closing in.
For every 20 new paid subscribers, we randomly select one listener to receive a Big Biology t-shirt or an episode art print. And when we hit that lucky number 500, the supporter gets a sweatshirt and a large framed print.
Head to bigbiology.substack.com, sign up, and help us keep bringing you big ideas from across the life sciences. Paid subscribers also get full-length episodes, behind-the-scenes debriefs, and extra audio from our guests.
I'm Marty Martin.
And I'm John Drake, and you're listening to Big Biology.
So, Jaap de Roode, welcome to Big Biology.
Thanks so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. We're really excited to have you here to talk about your new book, Doctors by Nature. I really enjoyed reading it, and I highly recommend that listeners pick up a copy. But to start, tell us why you wrote this book. You've worked on lots of things and could have written lots of different books on different topics, so why this particular one?
I think it's just so amazing to tell people about the ways that animals can use medicine. We often think that humans are kind of special, and we're always looking for ways that we are different, and that's especially so in Western culture. But it turns out that animals are really good at using all sorts of medicines, and all sorts of animals can do that. And I think that story is just so amazing, not just for the fascination of it and showing how cool nature is, but also to show us what we can learn from animals to improve the health of them, but also us, and to actually find new medicines that they may discover for us.
Yeah, okay. And I think we're obviously going to spend a lot of time on all of those various different species and the things that they do. But one of the species that you really focus on in the book are the monarch butterflies. You could have written an entire book just on migrations and, their beauty and the behaviors and such. But there is something special to you about them. And maybe, I'm giving away some of the thunder from the book, so I'll let you tell this story. But what is it about the monarchs that played a role in this particular topic?
Yeah, and that is how I got into the topic in the first place, because monarch butterflies become sick. They become sick with parasites, and you already alluded to them being pretty and doing this spectacular migration, and that's how most people know about monarch butterflies, right? Especially when you live in North America. Monarchs from Canada, the United States migrate to Mexico every year, where tens of millions of monarchs come together. It's really, really beautiful, spectacular. They're also very pretty, very clear, big orange butterflies. But I always like to tell people that's not the reasons I study them. I study them because they become sick. And we're very well aware, of course, that humans become sick with pathogens, parasites, all sorts of infectious diseases. We know this about our pets. Some people don't realize that all wild animals get infections as well. And so it is for monarch butterflies. So I started studying them to figure out what do they become sick with, what do they do about it, and then ultimately discovered that they can use medicine.
You must have gotten pushback early to ask the crazy question that butterflies get sick. And then the medication in general. That's, I would imagine, kind of a taboo thing to even ask.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And so to give a little bit of the background of what we actually found, when I first came to the United States in 2005 to study monarch butterflies, I really came to study their parasites. And I very quickly learned that monarch butterflies are specialist feeders as caterpillars on milkweeds. So adult butterflies can drink nectar from any flower, but the caterpillars can only eat milkweed. So you give them lettuce or you give them an oak leaf, they cannot eat it, they'll die. And these milkweeds contain chemicals that are called cardenolides. They're also known as heart poisons, very toxic chemicals. And traditionally, biologists have really looked at that as the monarchs using those toxins, taking them out of the milkweeds and using them as protection against predators. But because I was so biased thinking about parasites, I wanted to see if they can also use them against parasites. And so we started with very simple experiments rearing monarch butterflies on more and less toxic milkweed, and found that the more toxic milkweed really reduced the infection probability of the caterpillars, but also when they became infected, they suffered less from parasite growth and had fewer disease symptoms. And so having found that, then it was the question, can caterpillars use this? Or can the adults actually use it? So the question is, we know the plants can work medicinally. Can the animals actively use them as medicine? And you're right, that was kind of controversial, because I remember when we wrote up the paper to report on the fact that some milkweeds act medicinally, and others do not, and speculated in the discussion that we should then figure out if monarchs can use it, one of the reviewers said there's absolutely no way. And the editor made us remove it from the discussion. And that was frustrating, but nothing like a good frustration to spur you on to do the research, right? And so then we did the research following that. And we did 2 types of experiments. One was with caterpillars. So we had sick caterpillars and healthy caterpillars, gave them choices between the medicinal and non-medicinal milkweed. Absolutely no result, no effect. The caterpillars just ate whatever they found first. But then we really thought that kind of makes sense, because the caterpillars don't decide what they eat. It's their mothers that decide what they eat. It's the mothers that lay the eggs on the food, on the plant. The caterpillars come out, they're born on their food. That's what they're gonna eat. So then we did our other series of experiments with the adult butterflies, specifically looking at mothers that were sick, mothers that were not sick. Where do they lay their eggs? And found that they prefer to lay the eggs, when you give them a choice, on the more medicinal milkweed. And that then protects her offspring, not herself. But what happens is she actually passes on the parasites to the eggs. When the caterpillars come out of the eggs, they get the parasites, but at the same time they get this medicine that then reduces their infection and their disease.
Yeah, so it kind of sounds to me, like the distinction you're drawing between chemicals or toxins and medicines has something to do with whether or not the one taking them does that intentionally. I'm wondering if you have a fair and broad definition of medicine as a concept, something that could apply both to people and to animals.
It's a great question, and the answer is no. And it's actually, the funny thing is, when I was writing the book, I actually had a whole chapter on trying to define what medicine is. And my editor decided, and I agreed, that chapter wasn't going anywhere.
Oh, I would have liked that chapter.
I would like to see that too.
You would have liked it. Well, it was very meandering, because even think about, how do we define medicine as humans, right? So we have you and I probably have a very different view of medicine than if I talk to a traditional Chinese healer, right? So you already start thinking about, so what is medicine? So for writing the book, I was more focused on what is medication. And so I restricted myself, made it a little bit easier for me. So I excluded everything such as surgery, right? So I really focused on the use of chemicals. And those chemicals come not from the body itself, but animals or humans get those chemicals from their environment, whether it's fungi, whether it's animals, whether it's plants, they get it from another source. And then the other thing that was really important is that, there's a lot of chemicals, and oftentimes the chemicals, whether they have an effect, whether they act as food or medicine or poison, comes down to the dose. But it also means that the way we define it, a lot of people, when they study medication in animals, really define it as using a chemical that at high enough doses are also going to have side effects. So that's something that animals and humans have in common. When we take medicine, whether it's traditional medicine or we take medicine from our pharmacist, there's that whole leaflet with all the side effects. And you see that with animals as well. So I think that is an important thing that they have in common.
So medicine is facultative then, right? So I think you're saying that it only counts as medicine if it harms you when you're well, but it is beneficial when you're sick?
Medication. So I think medicine is a lot broader. So I restrict myself to medication. So the use of medicines/drugs, yes, that you use them, but there is side effects. And so when you don't need them, you avoid them. And we see that, of course, in humans, but we see that in animals as well. So oftentimes when animals use medicines, they pick out particular plants or particular chemicals that actually have these side effects. And when they don't need them, you see them avoiding them.
Okay. So it's understandable. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the complexity of medicine when you include surgery and presumably other behaviors that would keep you in good health and maybe prevent you from ever needing it. I guess this does get very complicated.
Exactly. So, think about Ayurvedic medicine. That includes yoga. So then the question is, well, actually my dogs do yoga because they do the downward dog, right? So we have trained them to one of my puppies, he can do, when I say yoga with a treat, he'll do the downward dog. But, which is also an aspect of health, right? Stretching and keeping everything supple. And so it becomes very complicated. So I restricted myself to medication.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And then, so it's not the case. The book definitely doesn't dodge definitions. I mean, what I really liked about the book is that you are trying to be explicit about what behaviors you're attributing to these animals. So there are 4 different variants of medication that you spend some time on: prophylaxis, therapeutic medication, body anointing, and fumigation. So they're all big classes, and I know there are lots of different stories. So maybe briefly explain a few of those and then give your favorite example.
Yeah, so I think that it's nice to have that categorization because they're all things that humans do as well. So when we think about therapeutic medication, that's the kind of medication you use when you are already sick. And so you do something in response to your symptoms. So you feel sick and you go to the doctor, you get a medication and take that, and it takes care of your symptoms. So chimpanzees, for example, do this when they're infected with worms. They specifically suck the bitter pith of a plant called bitter leaf, and that then gets rid of those worms. The second category is prophylaxis, and this would be the kind of thing, if I travel to an area where there is a lot of malaria, I take antimalarials before I go. And so this is something that you do in anticipation of becoming infected, because the risk is so high. You start already taking the medicine before you get sick, because the risk of getting sick is so high. But again, great, right? Because antimalarials, a lot of those have very strong side effects. So it's not something you want to keep on doing forever. So you do it when the risk is high. And so animals do this too. So there's particular baboons that live in areas where there's a lot of schistosome worm parasites, and they eat particular berries that are toxic to those parasites a lot more than the baboons that live in other places where there isn't as many of those. Then we have body anointing, and that's basically, smearing stuff onto your skin or into your fur that keeps bloodsuckers away. And so we see that, when we put anti-mosquito repellent on our skin to keep mosquitoes away, both to protect ourselves from the bites, but also from the parasites they transmit. I guess my favorite example is cats and the catnip response. So when cats roll around in catnip or silvervine, which is a plant that occurs in Asia, is much more potent than catnip, they coat themselves in chemicals that keep those mosquitoes away. And that's really cool because humans have patented that chemical now to see if we can use it for us as well. And then finally, like you mentioned, fumigation. And that's, so some people may be familiar, especially if you live in areas with a lot of infectious diseases caused by mosquitoes. You may be aware of the trucks coming by and basically, fogging your house, just coming in with all these mosquito sprays.
Oh, living in Florida, I'm quite familiar with this phenomenon.
Exactly. And animals do that. And there my favorite example is of house finches and sparrows that live in Mexico City and actually take discarded cigarette butts, put it in their nests, and that repels all sorts of ectoparasites, such as mites and lice and ticks.
So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the science of understanding self-medication by animals. For a biologist to conclude that an animal is medicating, you have some conditions that you think are, must be demonstrated. The behavior has to improve health or fitness. The resource used as a medicine has to be external. The animal has to seek out the resource, and that has to be costly in the absence of infection. Setting aside the last one, because that's maybe the hardest one to get around, I wonder if you can explain why these are important.
Yeah, so and I'm sure we're going to have a really fun discussion, but you really made me think about one of those conditions. But I'll start with that one, the condition that it has to help. Now, I think it's really important when you look at wild animals, and really this field started with observations, right? And it's really hard when you observe an animal, say a chimpanzee is eating a particular plant, then it gets better. Do you really know that is what happened, right? Is it the plant that did that? But when we talk about medication, we talk about a behavior. And so when we think about therapeutic medication, we think about an animal behaving differently when it is sick. Now, there are actually so many examples out there where it's not, that change in behavior is not benefiting the animal, but the parasites. There are so many parasites and pathogens that are really good at manipulating the host to create behaviors that are good for the parasites. And, so really fantastic examples. You think of rabies virus, for example. When that virus infects you, gets to your brain, causes this aggression, causes a lot of salivation where a lot of the virus particles are. So animals, including humans, become aggressive. When they bite others, they transmit that virus. It's a change in behavior. It's absolutely no medication. That's the parasite doing the talking. So that's why we said, you look at that behavior, it has to really help the host, not the parasite. So that is an important one. It has to be intentional. And I think that's one of the tricky parts. There was a lot of kind of skepticism, especially early on in the 1980s, but still, a lot of people say, well, these animals, it's just accidental. They eat something and then, it helps, but they didn't do it on purpose. So I think that intentionality is really important because it shows the animal is really seeking out something when it is sick or to prevent that sickness in the first place. And then the other thing is that it's a chemical or a substance that is not made by the body. So, you think about, we have a fantastic immune system, right? That takes care of a lot of infections. But I'm not going to call immune cells a medicine. So when we talk about the use of medicine, it's something they get from the environment, a chemical produced by a plant, or, even the morphology, the little hairs on a leaf that can scrape out parasites out of the gut, that kind of thing. So they don't make it themselves.
So I think it seems like the trickiness historically has been about the motivation and the attribution of this sophisticated way of thinking and planning and deliberating. So you use the words, it's a classic use of words in the book, but I'd like to hear more about what you mean when you say some behaviors are learned and some behaviors are innate. And it seemed over and over again, you're sort of invoking these are innate behaviors. What do you mean? I think that's how a lot of people would see it, but it almost felt like in saying that, well, now, okay, it makes sense. To me, I don't necessarily feel any better about something being an innate than learned. And it feels like psychology has changed a little bit where innate is no longer the simplified way of thinking about things as maybe it was pitched in the time of Piaget and others that popularized those ideas.
Yeah, it's also interesting, right? Because the innate is essentially the new word for instinct, because instinct has kind of gone out of vogue in the behavioral field. But first of all, what I like to say, when I talk about intentionality, a lot of people misinterpret that as animals knowing exactly what they do and having this complete awareness of what they are doing. And I think in most cases, animals don't know that they're infected. They don't know that what they're using is a medicine. They don't know that kills parasites and that therefore they get better. I think the intentionality can still be there as a response to a different state of the body. And so my favorite example comes from woolly bear caterpillars. And so beautiful research, these caterpillars get infected by parasitoid flies. Now, if you love parasites, parasitoid flies are just amazing, right?
Well, in the movie Alien, right, I think you use this example in the book, right?
Yeah, so these flies, what they do is they lay eggs on the caterpillar. The maggots come out, they eat their way into the insides of the caterpillar, eat it up. When they're ready to turn into adult flies, they burst out of this caterpillar and then pupate and become an adult fly, like the Alien movie. It's totally gross if you don't like parasites, right? It's absolutely horrific. So what's interesting about these woolly bear caterpillars, unlike the monarch caterpillars that I mentioned earlier, woolly bear caterpillars can eat a lot of different plants. So they have a very wide diet, and there are particular alkaloids in some of those plants that are detrimental, that they kill the flies. And the other really cool thing about these caterpillars is they have 4 taste receptors, and one of them tastes these alkaloids specifically. And what researchers have shown is that you can actually put tiny electrodes in these individual taste buds, which is totally amazing. And they did this with infected and uninfected caterpillars, and they gave them the alkaloids, and they can measure how rapidly are these nerve cells connected to these taste buds firing. And they found when they're infected, these taste buds go crazy. And basically, so they respond more strongly. And the way to interpret that is that when this caterpillar is infected, these alkaloids taste better, it eats more, and now it kills the flies, right? So the caterpillar doesn't need to know what a fly is. It doesn't need to know what an alkaloid is. It doesn't need to know that when it eats them, it's going to get better. All it knows, whether it really knows, all it's aware of is that these alkaloids suddenly taste really great. So I think that's a really good example of an innate behavior, but it's still intentional because it starts eating more of it. And now it is really helping it. So it doesn't need any consciousness about it. So I think a lot of examples are really baked into the body, baked into the genes.
Okay, and I'm not going to beat up this issue because this is not the focus, but I think that's to me, this sort of innate solves the problem. It's just, we've got great big complicated brains and we can do behaviors in special ways that many organisms can't. But you very much made a great case that the taste receptors know, The brain maybe doesn't know, but an important part of the body does, in fact, know. I mean, it knows, maybe it can learn. We could talk about other examples where learning is happening, but it's not happening in the skull, it's happening somewhere else in the body.
Yeah, and I think we're learning a lot about the connections between the guts and the brain. But also, I would say what I find really intriguing is that we have this big brain. We're very, conscious. We think we're very rational beings. But even in our case, we cannot override what our body is telling us sometimes. And in the book, I give the example of food poisoning. And so sometimes you eat something, you get very sick. And then sometimes we associate it with something we ate that wasn't actually what made us sick. And this is actually a big problem in the treatment of cancer and in chemotherapy. And what doctors have learned over time is that when you give a particular meal, and people may say before they do this treatment, they want to have one last meal where they have everything they really like, whether it's French fries or chocolate or, and then they do the treatment, they get really sick. And they know it wasn't the chocolate that made them sick. They know it's the chemotherapy, but they cannot stand chocolate anymore. They won't eat it. And so sometimes that big brain gets in the way, or cannot even override what our body is telling us. So I think those innate mechanisms where our gut talks to our brain, and that's more, the more primitive brain that's been around a long time, I think is very important and is really involved. Because when you think about individual learning, that's often associations. So what I just mentioned is a negative association, but you see a lot of animals, when they're sick, they eat something, they feel better, and the next time they feel sick, they seek out that thing that made them better. So you get these preferences and aversions that are learned, but very not consciously.
So if we can circle back to that last condition for thinking about medicating behavior, that it's costly, what does it mean that a behavior is costly in the absence of medication? And if it's not medicating itself, where does that cost come from?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And it's actually really hard to test in a lot of different systems. So where we have seen a lot of advancements over the last 20 years is a lot of studies on insects where you can really much more easily do experiments, right? So when you study, say, chimpanzees and you study how they medicate themselves, or you study elephants, it's really hard to do manipulative experiments where you purposefully infect them and then either give them the medicine or not, or you give them medicine where they're not sick and see, what is their lifetime fitness? How many offspring do they have? Really hard with animals like that. But we can do that with caterpillars, we can do that with flies, we can do that with honeybees. And so, for example, in my own work with the monarch butterflies, when we rear caterpillars on really medicinal, highly medicinal milkweed, some species of milkweed are so medicinal it kills all the parasites, but it also kills 90% of the monarchs that eat it, right? So it's a very clear cost. But we also know for chimpanzees, I mentioned the bitter leaf before, that they use when they are infected with worms. They avoid it when they're not infected. And when they eat too much of it, it can actually kill them. So that's a very clear cost, right? Loss of health, even over a few days, could be detrimental. Or loss of appetite, maybe they'll be less able to survive, or maybe not have a child in that season if you look at particular species. It's hard to quantify, much easier in insects than a lot of other species.
So that's interesting. I mean, evolutionary biologists tend to see fitness as the currency for all costs. Thinking about clinical medicine, we think about it in terms of physiologic function and that kind of thing. And so I guess you're, postulating that there's some link between these two. As you just said, even if you're ill for a few days, then, that could have a negative consequence for your lifetime fitness. But do you think that's how sickness usually works out? I mean, most of the sicknesses that I medicate for, I don't think are life-threatening.
Maybe not life-threatening, but that may also be because of the way we live, right? I think if you live in a hunter-gatherer society as humans evolved in, then, being down with a fever for 4 days may be really detrimental to your survivorship and your ability to get food or your ability to protect your offspring. If I get fever for 4 days, I stay home. I let people at work know I'm not coming in. My fridge is still full of food. I think, so in some ways, I think, when we look at wild animals that live more like when we were still wild, I think even a few days of disease can really be detrimental. You can also think even of, hierarchy in social groups. When you're too sick to maintain a hierarchy, you may actually lose your place in that social group, lose your reproduction for the next few years. I think there's a lot of ways that this can play out.
Hi there. You've been listening to the free version of Big Biology. To hear the rest of this episode, you need to subscribe.
To do that, head to bigbiology.substack.com and sign up for a paid subscription. There are a lot of different membership options available.
Not only will you get access to the rest of this episode, you'll also get access to extras like our episode debriefs, behind-the-scene content from Keating, our artist, about how he makes the cover art for each show, and more from our guests about their path to science and their hobbies.